He found it in the rain behind the gleaming office tower where he worked. A canvas slashed, face down in a dumpster, the eyes of a stranger staring up through the grime. He was just the building painter, but he knew what it was. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him that someone had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't trash. This was a portrait, and it was crying out to be saved. His name was Leo, a single father who painted walls for a living. But the hands that mixed beige and eggshell had once performed a different, far more delicate magic. He kept that past locked away, a secret buried with his wife. To everyone here, he was just the quiet guy with the dropped claws. So why would a man hiding from his own history risk everything to salvage a stranger's ruined portrait? Because Leo saw something in the damage that no one else could. At 34, Leo's life was a study in careful, quiet maintenance. His world was measured in gallons of paint, square feet of drywall, and the precious hours between dropping his daughter Mia at school and picking her up. Their small apartment was filled with her drawings, not his. The only hint of his old life was a wooden toolbox kept on a high closet shelf, its contents untouched for years. He was a ghost in his own story, and he preferred it that way. 5 years earlier, everything had been color. Leo had worked in the conservation department of the City Museum, a rising star with a preternatural feel for oil paint. He could read a canvas like a map, see where the artist had hesitated, where joy had guided the brush. His wife, Elena, was a curator. They were a team, their life a beautiful, busy gallery of plans and projects. Then, the diagnosis. 6 months later, he was a widower with a 4-year-old daughter, and a grief so vast it rendered his exquisite skill meaningless. The museum offered bereavement leave. He never went back. The art world felt like a monument to a life he could no longer bear to look at. Painting walls was honest. It was physics. Primer, paint, 2 coats. No hidden meanings, no legacy to interpret. The money was enough. The silence was a relief. He told Mia he used to fix old things, a vague truth that satisfied a child's curiosity. The real truth that he had once revived a Rembrandt sketch, that his hands had steadied the heartbeat of centuries, was packed away with Elena's clothes. A life for a life. He traded masterpiece restoration for marking baseboards with blue tape. The Viridian Tower, a 40-story glass sphere in the financial district, was his current contract. For 2 weeks, he'd been repainting the executive lobby on the night shift, alone with the hum of the HVAC and the spectral glow of exit signs. It was during a trash run to the loading dock that he saw it. Not just canvas in the dumpster, but specifically oil on canvas. The way it caught the sodium vapor light was a language he still understood. He shouldn't have climbed in, but his painter's hands acted before his father's mind could object. The portrait was of an elegant woman in her 60s, her expression kind, wise. The slash was vicious, a long, angry rip from shoulder to chin. It was also fresh, the edges of the tear hadn't yet curled or collected grime. Someone had destroyed this recently and with intent. But the real shock was the painting's soul. Despite the violence, the technique was loving. This wasn't a mass-produced decor piece. This was original work, imbued with a personal connection. The signature in the corner was obscured by muck. He knew, with the cold clarity of an expert, that this was no accident. This was an act of rage or profound grief, and it had been discarded like yesterday's news. He hid the painting under his drop cloths. All night, as he rolled pale gray onto the walls, his mind worked on the portrait. The lining was still stable. The tear, while severe, hadn't fragmented the face. In the right hands, it could be made whole again. But those hands weren't his anymore. Were they? The next evening, after tucking Mia in, the pull was magnetic. He dragged the toolbox from its shelf. The scent of linseed oil and Dammer varnish flooded the room, the smell of his past. He laid the portrait on the kitchen table under the bright LED light. With a magnifying headset, he began his autopsy. The canvas was linen, high quality. The ground layer was intact. The slash had cleaved through the paint and priming, but the threads, while severed, were clean. This was repairable, more than repairable. It was a plea. Then he found it. A tiny, almost invisible inscription painted along the inside of the subject's collar. A date. For Maya Leaner always, Mother, Christmas 1998. His breath caught. This was a mother's gift to a daughter, a cherished personal heirloom, not office art, a family relic. Why was it here in this corporate tower, and who would do this? A quick, uneasy online search the next morning answered the first question. Eleanor Vance was the founding CEO of Vance Capital, which owned the Viridian Tower. A formidable figure in finance, her face was in business journals, sharp, severe, a world away from the gentle woman in the portrait. The math clicked. The portrait was of Eleanor Vance's mother. It had hung in her office, and now it was in a dumpster, mutilated. Leo was standing at a dangerous crossroads. Taking the painting was technically theft, even from the trash. Restoring it without permission was an ethical breach in his old profession. Unearthing his tools risked unearthing a pain he'd spent years burying. He had every reason to fold the canvas back up, return it to the metal bin, and walk away. But he looked at the portrait's eyes. They were Elena's eyes, not in color or shape, but in the quiet love they held. He saw a daughter's connection, severed not by death but by something uglier. He saw a story broken, and the ghost of the man he used to be, the conservator who believed in saving stories, stirred for the first time in half a decade. He made his choice. He cleared the small, sunlit breakfast nook, moving Mia's cereal box and crayons. He set up a makeshift conservation studio, a board, his tools, a gooseneck lamp. It would take weeks of nights after Mia was asleep. He'd have to source materials quietly, avoid questions. It was a solitary, secret mission. He was no longer just Leo the painter. He was a man about to cross a line, using a forgotten key to unlock a stranger's tragedy. He took a surgical blade, its edge gleaming under the light. The first step was the most dangerous, cleaning the wound. One slip, one wrong solvent, and the memory in the paint would be erased forever. He leaned in, his heartbeat the only sound in the room. The point of the blade touched the ragged edge, and he began. The first suture was the hardest, not on the canvas, on him. Each careful stitch with the fine surgical thread rejoining the torn linen from behind was a suture on his own buried life. Muscle memory flooded back, the specific tension, the knotting technique he'd used on 15th-century altarpieces. For 3 hours under the silent kitchen light, the past was not a ghost. It was a tool, and it worked. The physical repair was a meticulous 3-stage puzzle. First, he stabilized the canvas on a new backing, a process called lining. Then, filling the gash with a reversible putty, sculpting it to match the texture of the original brushstrokes, a task requiring the touch of a sculptor. Finally would come the magic trick, inpainting, matching the exact pigments, the specific glaze to make the wound disappear. But that was weeks away. For now, he was a surgeon setting the bone. His days became a double life. By day, Leo the painter mixed gallons of platinum mist for the Viridian Tower's corridors, his coveralls smelling of latex. His coworkers talked about sports, weekend plans. He nodded, smiled, all while mentally calculating the drying time for a layer of isolation varnish he'd applied at 3 a.m. By night, he became someone else. After Mia's bedtime, the breakfast nook transformed. The portrait, slowly healing under his hands, became his secret confessional. He began to see the artist's hand in intimate detail. This wasn't just a competent portrait. The brushwork in the mother's hands was tender. The light in the eyes was rendered with patient, doting layers. This was painted by someone who loved the subject deeply. The inscription confirmed it, a mother's gift. But the violence of the slash, it spoke of a love turned to fury, or unbearable pain. A new, gnawing question emerged. Why was it thrown away? Not stored, not put in a closet, discarded in a commercial dumpster destined for a compactor. That was an act of eradication. He started paying closer attention at work. He listened to the building staff, the gossip in the break room. He learned that Eleanor Vance, the CEO, had been through a brutal public divorce finalized just 2 months prior. Her ex-husband, a venture capitalist, had moved out of their penthouse. The portrait, according to a security guard who remembered it, had hung behind her desk for a decade. Then, one day after the divorce, it was gone. The guard assumed she'd taken it home. But Leo had found it, slashed and discarded. The timeline pointed to one terrible, obvious conclusion. Alina Vance herself had destroyed her mother's portrait. In a fit of rage or grief or some toxic cocktail of both after her marriage collapsed, she had attacked this symbol of familial love. The thought made Leo's mission feel suddenly hopeless, even foolish. He was pouring his soul into restoring a treasure that its owner had tried to kill. What if she saw it again and just finished the job? He almost quit. He stood over the nearly stabilized canvas, putty knife in hand, frozen. He was projecting, he knew, seeing his own loss in her actions. Maybe her destruction wasn't malice, but madness, the kind of pain that makes you destroy the things you hold most dear because their beauty is too sharp a contrast to your inner ruin. He had felt that. He'd packed away his own toolbox, hadn't he? In a way, that was also a destruction. He looked at the portrait's eyes, which seemed to hold a boundless, patient forgiveness. He made a decision. It didn't matter why she did it. The portrait itself deserved to exist. Its story wasn't over. Weeks bled into a month. The putty was sanded, feathered, perfected. Now came the true test of his forgotten skill, the inpainting. This was where most amateur restorers failed catastrophically, slathering on new paint that obscured the original like a fog. Professional inpainting is about illusion. You mix your pigments to match not just the color, but the age of the color, the way decades of light have mellowed a red, the subtle crackle pattern in the varnish. You apply it with a brush so fine it holds maybe 3 hairs, dotting in color only where the original is missing, never touching the surviving paint. It's a form of time travel. Leo's hand trembled the first time he loaded his brush with a meticulously matched flesh tone. One mistake here was permanent. He took a breath, thought of Alina's steadying presence in their old lab, and let his training take over. Dot, dot, a microscopic fleck of paint. He leaned back, checked it under the light. It disappeared into the original, a perfect match. A wave of relief, then exhilaration, washed through him. He was still here. The artist in him was not dead. The process was achingly slow. He reconstructed a centimeter of the mother's cheek one night, the curve of her collar the next. He became an archaeologist of joy, reverse engineering the love with which the portrait was made. He found himself talking to the painting, to Alina in the quiet hours. See this transition. She used a warm gray here, not a cool one. Smart. It was the most alive he'd felt in 5 years. Meanwhile, the pressure in his double life intensified. His foreman at the tower job asked why he looked so tired. Mia, now 7 and acutely perceptive, found a smear of ochre pigment on his wrist. "Daddy, you're painting different colors at night." He spun a tale about a special project for a friend, the lie sour on his tongue. The secret was a wall growing between him and his daughter, and it hurt more than he expected. Then the first major crisis. He needed a specific rare resin to mix a final glazing medium, a varnish that would unify the restored areas with the old. It couldn't be bought at a hardware store. He had to order it from a specialty conservation supplier, using his old professional account he'd never closed. The package was delivered to his apartment while he was at work. Mia signed for it. That evening she presented him with a small, discreet box. "It's from the art place," she said, her eyes wide with curiosity. The return label bore the name of a famous art supply house known exclusively to museums and conservators. The jig was up. He knelt before her, the weight of the secret finally too heavy. "Mia," he said, his voice thick, "I need to show you something." He led her to the nook, now bathed in the gentle glow of the restoration lamp. He pulled back the protective cloth. The portrait was nearly whole. The savage scar was now a faint, seamless whisper only he could see. Mia gasped. "You fixed the lady." He explained in simple terms what he used to do, why he stopped, and why this painting needed him. He didn't mention the CEO or the dumpster. He spoke about saving something that was broken. Mia listened, then reached out a small finger, stopping just before touching the canvas. "You made her smile again," she whispered. In that moment the wall crumbled. He had an accomplice. But the outside world was closing in. At the Viridian Tower, the lobby project was finishing. In 2 weeks his crew would be gone. His window to return the painting, to complete this insane, personal quest, was slamming shut. How do you give back a stolen, restored masterpiece without getting arrested? He had no plan, only a conviction that it had to go home. His research into Alina Vance deepened, taking a darker turn. He read profiles, watched interviews. The narrative was of a ruthless, self-made billionaire, a steel magnolia who crushed competitors. But in one old magazine piece from around the time the portrait was painted, he found a different Alina. She spoke about her mother, a humble school teacher who painted as a hobby, who instilled in her the courage to start her own firm. "She taught me that creating something is the bravest act," the young Alina said. The article mentioned the portrait, calling it her most prized possession. The contradiction was staggering. The portrait was the symbolic heart of her origin story, and she had cut it out. Why? The divorce was too simple an answer. There was a deeper fracture here, one Leo felt unequipped to understand but was now responsible for mending. The final night of imprinting arrived. The last millimeter of the slash, where it crossed the mother's pearl necklace, required mixing a pigment with ground mother-of-pearl to catch the light correctly. He worked until dawn, his world reduced to the luminous gray of pre-morning light and the faint scent of ozone from his lamp. Finally, he laid down his brush. He applied the final unifying glaze, a whisper-thin layer that married his work with the old. He turned off the lamp and let the first true sunlight of day wash over the portrait. It was whole, not just repaired, resurrected. The mother's face glowed with serene kindness, the slash now a memory known only to him and the canvas. He had done it. He had crossed the bridge back to his old self and brought something precious across with him. A profound, quiet pride settled over him, followed immediately by a tidal wave of terror. Now came the impossible part. He had to get it back into the Viridian Tower, into the CEO's office on the 42nd floor, past layers of security, cameras, and assistants. He was a painter with a finished contract. He had no access, no reason to be there. He was holding a piece of someone else's soul, and he had no way to deliver it. The mission, it seemed, was impossible. And in 1 week, the building's security system would be upgraded. His temporary worker clearance would expire forever, and the portrait would be trapped in his tiny apartment, a beautiful, haunting monument to a failure of nerve. The clock was ticking, and he had no idea how to make time stand still. The solution, when it came, was absurdly simple and born of sheer desperation. He still had his painter's keycard for 1 more week. It granted access to service elevators and the maintenance floors, not the executive suite, but it could get him into the building after hours. The rest would require a different kind of skill, observation. He spent his final day on the job not painting but mapping. He noted the security camera blind spots in the service corridors, places where ducts or pipes created visual cover. He watched the evening cleaning crew's routine, memorizing the 20-minute window when the 42nd floor was empty. The plan was terrifyingly flimsy. Get in, leave the portrait where she would find it, get out. He wasn't a spy. He was a dad with a painting and a prayer. The night of the attempt, he told Mia he had to run back to work to get a tool he'd left behind. The lie was acid in his throat. She hugged him and said, "Be careful, Dad." He drove to the tower, the portrait wrapped in a plain, moving blanket on the passenger seat, feeling more like a criminal than a rescuer. The loading dock was deserted. His keycard beeped. A green light flickered. He was in. The service elevator was a rattling metal cage. It smelled of bleach and stale air. Each floor ding was a hammer blow to his nerves. On the 42nd floor, the hallway was dark, lit only by emergency strips. The plush carpet silenced his steps. He could see the glass door of Vance Capital at the end of the hall, etched with its elegant logo. His keycard wouldn't work there. This was where the plan turned from flimsy to outright insane. He had to wait. He hid in an alcove housing a fire extinguisher, the blanket-trapped portrait leaning against his legs. He watched the cleaning team, 2 people with a cart, finish the Vance offices and move on to the next suite. The moment they turned the corner, he moved. He went not to the main door, but to a secondary, unmarked door he'd spotted weeks ago, a janitorial closet. He tried the handle. Locked. but the lock was a simple pin tumbler, old and worn. From his toolkit, he pulled a tension wrench and a pick. This was not a skill from the museum. This was a skill from a different, harder part of his youth before Alina, before stability. A lock clicked open in under 10 seconds. The closet was a small room with shelves of supplies. It had another door on the far side. He opened it a crack. It led directly into the back of the Vance Capital reception area. He was in. The office was a monument to cold power. Sleek lines, black marble, modern art that felt calculated, not felt. It was utterly silent. Her private office was through a heavy oak door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside, and there on the floor, leaning against the wall behind the massive desk, was the empty hook, the ghost of where the portrait had lived. The sight of it, that naked spot, filled him with a sudden, fierce certainty. He was right to do this. He unwrapped the portrait. In the dim light from the city skyline, it seemed to glow with its own warmth. He lifted it, his muscles straining. The ornate frame was heavy, and guided it onto the hook. It settled with a soft, final click. For a moment, he just stared. The kind, painted face of the mother looked back at him, presiding once more over her daughter's empire of steel and glass. His work was done. He turned to leave. And froze. On the edge of the CEO's immaculate desk, next to a closed laptop, was a small, framed photograph. It was of Alina Vance and an older woman, the same woman from the portrait, both laughing, arms around each other on a sunny porch. The love in that snapshot was palpable, vibrant. It completely shattered his theory. This was not a woman who hated her mother. This was a woman grieving her. The slash on the canvas wasn't an act of fury toward the mother. It was something else. A scream of loss, a symbolic self-destruction. He didn't have time to untangle it. A sound echoed from the outer office. A soft click, a footstep. Panic seized him. He ducked behind the large desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the main office lights flick on, saw the line of light under the door brighten. Then the sound of the oak door opening. He held his breath. From his hiding place, he could only see a pair of black designer heels step into the room, then stop. Utter silence. A silence so profound and heavy he could feel the air change. Then a sound he would never forget. A sharp, gasping intake of breath like someone punched in the stomach. Then a choked, broken whisper. "Mom." He heard the heels take 2 unsteady steps forward. Then a rustle of fabric as if she'd sunk to her knees. A soft, shuddering sob filled the dark room. Leo closed his eyes, pressed against the cold wood of the desk, trapped. He was an intruder on a sacred, private moment. He had wanted her to find it, but not like this. Not with him here. The sobbing continued, raw and unfiltered, the sound of a dam breaking after years of pressure. After what felt like an eternity, he heard movement, a hand slapping the desk for support. She was getting up. He braced for discovery, for the scream, for security. But instead, he heard her walk slowly to the wall. He heard her fingers gently brush the surface of the canvas. "How?" she whispered to the empty room. "Who did this?" This was his moment. He could reveal himself, explain, but the fear was paralyzing. She was a billionaire CEO. He was a trespassing painter with a criminal tool in his pocket. His story would sound insane. He stayed hidden. He heard her move to her desk, the click of a lamp, the soft tap of a computer waking up. Then her voice, now tight with command, though still thick with tears. "Marcus, it's Alina. I need you to pull all security footage for the executive floor from the last 48 hours. Now, and discreetly. Something has happened in my office." Leo's blood ran cold. The cameras. He'd been so careful with the service corridors, but he hadn't considered the cameras inside her private office. Of course there were cameras. He was on film. Right now, her head of security was probably watching a live feed of a man hiding behind her desk. The mission had just catastrophically pivoted from a secret gift to a breaking and entering case. He had to move, now, while she was distracted on the call. The door to the janitor's closet was on the other side of the room. There was no cover. It was a 10-foot dash through open space, directly in her line of sight if she turned. He counted her pauses on the phone, listening to the tone of her voice. She was angry, confused, demanding answers. He made his decision. As she said, "I don't care about protocols, just find him," Leo burst from behind the desk. He didn't look at her. He ran straight for the closet door. He heard a sharp cry of alarm, the clatter of a phone hitting the desk. "Stop! Security!" He yanked the closet door open, slammed it behind him, and raced through the dark supply room to the outer door. He emerged into the service hallway and ran, not for the elevator, but for the stairwell. His footsteps echoed like gunshots in the concrete cavern. He made it to his truck, his hands shaking so violently he could barely get the key in the ignition. He drove, not home, but aimlessly, his mind a hurricane of panic and regret. He had done the right thing for the painting, and he had potentially destroyed his life, Mia's life. They would trace the keycard. They would have his face, his name. He was a felon. For 2 days he lived in a state of suspended terror. He jumped at every car that passed the apartment. He couldn't sleep. Mia asked if he was sick. He said he was just tired. The waiting was worse than the act itself. On the morning of the 3rd day, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside his apartment building. A man in a dark suit got out. Not a police uniform, but the vibe was unmistakable. Private security. Corporate. This was it. Leo watched from the window, his stomach a knot of ice. The man checked a tablet, looked up at the building numbers, and walked toward his entrance. Leo met him at the door before he could knock. The man was ex-military, calm, with appraising eyes. Mr. Leon, not his full name, a deliberate use of the name on his painting contract. "My name is Marcus. Ms. Vance would like to speak with you." "Am I under arrest?" "No, sir, you are invited." The distinction was chilling. "There's a car." Leo looked back into the apartment at Mia's crayon drawing on the fridge. He had no choice. "I need to take my daughter to school first." "We can wait." The ride to Mia's school was the longest of his life. He held her hand tightly. "Who's that man, Daddy?" "Just someone from an old job, sweetie." He hugged her at the school gate, a hug that felt like it could be the last. "I love you, Mia. Remember that." Her confused, worried face was the last thing he saw before the car door closed. The black sedan did not go to the Viridian Tower. It drove to a private airfield on the city's outskirts. On the tarmac sat a small, sleek jet. Marcus led him up the steps. Inside, in a sumptuous leather seat, sat Eleanor Vance. She looked nothing like her magazine photos. The power suit was there, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale without its usual makeup. She held a tablet. On its screen was a frozen image, a clear shot of Leo from the office camera, caught in profile as he ran for the closet. She looked from the screen to him, her expression unreadable. "Sit." The jet's door closed, sealing them in a silent, pressurized room. She didn't speak for a full minute, just studied him. Then she said, "The restoration is flawless. I had it examined by a curator from the Metropolitan. He said it was some of the most masterful, sensitive inpainting he's ever seen. Work of that level, it's essentially a ghost profession. There are maybe 200 people in the world who can do it, and none of them paint walls in the Viridian Tower." She tapped the tablet. "You are Leo, the contract painter. But the man who did this work, who is he?" This was the moment of truth. He could lie, cling to the crumbling facade, or he could finally speak his history aloud. He chose truth. "His name was Leo," he said quietly. "He was a senior conservator at the City Museum. He specialized in European oil paintings. He lost his wife 5 years ago, and then he disappeared." Eleanor absorbed this, her gaze piercing. "Why was my mother's portrait in a dumpster?" So she knew that part too. Security must have traced his movements back to the loading dock. "I found it there, slashed. I don't know why." A flicker of immense pain crossed her face. "My ex-husband," she said, the words clipped. "The final argument, he said my mother's memory, this portrait, was a crutch, that I loved a ghost more than I could love a living person. He took a letter opener from the desk and she trailed off, looking out the window. I was so shocked, so numb, I just told the building manager to remove the debris. I couldn't look at it. I thought it was gone forever. A fitting end to that chapter of my life." She turned back to him, tears welling again. "Until you brought her back to me." Leo felt the world shift beneath him. He hadn't restored a treasure destroyed by its owner's hate. He had salvaged a victim of a bystander's cruelty. The narrative he'd built in his head was wrong. Why, she asked, the question simple and enormous. Why risk everything? You stole it. You broke into my office. You could go to jail for a very long time for a stranger. He thought of Alina, of the portrait's eyes, of the empty hook on the wall. Because, he said, his voice rough, some things are too important to be left broken, even if they belong to someone else. Alina Vance stared at him. Then she did something utterly unexpected. She reached over, took the tablet, and with a few swift taps, deleted the security video file. The incriminating evidence vanished into digital oblivion. The building's logs show a painter's keycard was used for after-hours access to retrieve a forgotten tool. A misunderstanding of protocol. No charges will be filed. Leo could only stare, stunned. You're letting me go. I'm not letting you go, Mr. Leon, she said, a new intensity in her eyes. I'm offering you a job. My mother left me more than this portrait. She left me a collection. Dozens of her paintings stored in a vault, many damaged by time and poor storage. They're my inheritance, my history, and I need the ghost to bring them back to life. She leaned forward. Name your salary, your studio, your terms, just help me save them. It was an unimaginable offer. Redemption, purpose, financial security for Mia, all wrapped in the work he loved. It was everything he thought he'd lost forever, handed back to him by the woman whose tragedy he'd secretly mended. He had walked into this cabin expecting handcuffs. Instead, he was being handed a key to his own future. But as he looked at Alina Vance's expectant, grief-softened face, he felt a new, different tension. This wasn't an end. It was a beginning. And beginnings, he knew from bitter experience, were fragile things. He had to say yes. But first, he had one non-negotiable condition. My daughter, Leo said, the words quiet but absolute in the hushed cabin. She comes first, always. The hours are mine to set. If she's sick, if she has a school play, I'm gone. No questions. And the studio, it needs a window, a big one. Natural light is non-negotiable. He wasn't negotiating a salary. He was building a life raft with Mia at the center. Alina Vance didn't blink. Done. She extended her hand. The deal was struck not in a boardroom, but in the emotional wreckage they were both salvaging. She wasn't hiring an employee. She was commissioning a resurrectionist. 2 weeks later, Leo stood in a sun-drenched loft on the top floor of a converted warehouse. It was his new studio, courtesy of Vance Capital. The north-facing wall was a single pane of glass, flooding the space with perfect, shadowless light. His old tools were laid out on a new stainless steel table. Along one wall, carefully uncrated, were 27 paintings by Alina's mother, Margaret. Landscapes, still lifes, portraits of a young Alina. The collection was a life rendered in oil and love. And each one bore the scars of neglect, yellowed varnish, fine cracks, tears, water stains. His first day, Alina visited. She didn't wear a suit. She wore jeans and stood silently as he examined the first painting, a small landscape of a lake at dusk. Can you save them all? She asked, her voice small. I can save everyone, he said, and for the first time he believed it. The work became his anchor. His days took on a new rhythm. He took Mia to school, then worked in the luminous studio until pickup. Sometimes Mia did her homework in the corner, the smell of linseed oil and old canvas becoming as familiar to her as the scent of home. Alina visited often, not as a CEO, but as a client, a daughter. She'd bring coffee, ask quiet questions about the process. Slowly, over brushes and solvent, a fragile, professional friendship was built on a foundation of shared, unspoken loss. Leo's first major project from the collection was a large, ambitious portrait of Margaret's own mother, Alina's grandmother. It was severely cracked, the paint cupping and lifting like dried mud. Restoring it was a deep dive into lineage, an act of healing that stretched across 3 generations of women. As he painstakingly consolidated the flacking paint, dot by microscopic dot, he felt a strange peace. He wasn't just fixing paintings. He was reconnecting threads of memory that time had frayed. He was doing for Alina what no one could do for him, giving her back tangible pieces of a loved one's heart. The change in Alina was visible. The steel in her eyes remained, but the brittle edge softened. She began talking about her mother not with corporate-approved sound bites, but with stories. How Margaret would paint while listening to jazz, how she'd hide little messages in the corners of her canvases for Alina to find. One afternoon, watching Leo work, she said, "You know, she wanted to be a real artist, show in galleries, but she had me young, put it all aside. These paintings, they were her private world. And I treated them like furniture." The guilt in her voice was palpable. "You're treating them like treasures now," Leo said, not looking up from his work. "That's what matters." Meanwhile, Leo's own world was healing. The money from the job, a generous, life-changing salary, erased the constant low-grade fear of bills. He moved Mia to a better school, bought her a real bed, not just a mattress on the floor. But the greater wealth was in the work itself. The ghost of his old self stepped fully into the light, no longer a haunting presence but a guiding one. He started teaching Mia little things: how to see color temperature, how to hold a brush. He told her stories about her mother, Alina, framing them not in sorrow, but in the joy of her expertise, her laughter in the lab. The past became a place they could visit together, not a locked room. The project took over a year. One by one, the paintings were revived. A still life of pears regained its dewy glow. A stormy seascape recovered its terrifying majesty. The portrait of the grandmother, when finished, seemed to breathe with a serene dignity that stopped Alina in her tracks. She cried again, but this time it was a clean, quiet release. For the grand finale, Alina decided on an exhibition, not in a public gallery but in the renovated lobby of the Viridian Tower. She turned the cold, corporate space into a warm gallery, dedicating it to Margaret Vance, artist, mother, founder. The centerpiece, of course, was the restored portrait of Margaret, now hanging proudly where it belonged, with a small, discreet plaque that read, "Restored by Leo Merck." No title, just a name. The opening night was for building staff and their families. Leo brought Mia, who wore a dress she'd picked out herself. They stood to the side, watching people, janitors, security guards, secretaries, executives, file past the paintings, their faces softening with wonder. These people had only known Alina Vance as a figure of power. Now they saw the soul of the woman who built it all. Alina found them. She knelt to be eye level with Mia. "Your dad," she said, "he gave me back my mom." Mia, with a child's profound simplicity, replied, "He's good at fixing important things." Then Alina stood and faced Leo. She held out a small, flat box. "This is yours. I should have given it to you the day we met." Inside the box was not money nor a contract. It was a single small canvas board, a painting. It was a study of a man's hands holding a delicate brush caught in a beam of golden light. The style was unmistakably Margaret's, looser, more impressionistic than her other work, but filled with warmth. The hands were clearly Leo's. The date in the corner was from just 2 months earlier. Leo was stunned. "When, how?" "I asked her to paint it," Alina said softly. "From a photo I took of you working. I wanted you to have something from her too, not just your work on her legacy, her work on yours." It was a staggering gift, a portrait of his own healing, painted by the mother he had helped bring back from the brink. The loop was closed perfectly. As the crowd thinned, Alina gestured to the restored portrait of her mother. "I have a proposal, a final one." She took a deep breath. "I'm endowing a small conservation wing at the City Museum, focusing on preserving the work of overlooked artists, particularly women. I'd like you to be the director, part-time. You set the hours. You train the next generation. You give other stories the same chance." Leo looked at Mia, who was carefully studying a small landscape, then at the portrait of Margaret, then at the painting of his own hands. He had come full circle, not to the man he was, but to a new man, forged in loss and repair. The museum, the place he'd fled, was now offering a homecoming on his own terms. "I have one condition," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Alina raised an eyebrow, a mirror of her old corporate self. "Another one." "The wing," he said. It needs to be named for two people, the Margaret Vance Wing for Conservation and the Alina Merck Studio. Alina's eyes glistened. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It's already in the paperwork, she finally managed. The night ended. Leo and Mia drove home through the city lights, the painting of his hands resting carefully on the back seat. Mia fell asleep in the car, her head leaning against the window. Leo carried her up to their new, brighter apartment, tucked her in, and then stood in the doorway of his own small study. On the wall, he hung the new painting beside a photograph of Alina. Two artists, separated by time and death, now in conversation. One had painted the world she saw. The other had dedicated his life to saving those visions. And he, caught between them, was finally whole. He was no longer the man who found broken things. He was the man who knew how to make them live again, for himself, for his daughter, and for anyone who had ever loved something enough to mourn its cracks. The secret competence was a secret no more. It was a gift, passed from a grieving daughter to a grieving father, mediated by the gentle, patient hands of a mother who never stopped painting her love. And in that exchange, in the silent language of restored light and color, they had all finally come home. So what do we call a story like this? A miracle, a coincidence? Perhaps it's something simpler and far more profound, a testament to the quiet power of seeing what others have discarded and recognizing the value hidden beneath the damage. Leo wasn't looking for redemption in that dumpster. He was just doing his job, but his true skill, the one buried by grief, recognized a kindred brokenness, and in choosing to heal it, he healed himself. This tale lives in that fragile space where loss and grace intersect. It asks a question we all face. When confronted with something shattered, be it a painting, a dream, or a life, do we look away, or do we pick up the pieces? Leo's journey reminds us that our most vital competencies are often born from our deepest wounds. The hands that learned to hold a brush with love were trained in the furnace of loss. The eye that could see a masterpiece in ruin was an eye that had learned to look past its own devastation. The portrait of Margaret Vance was more than pigment and canvas. It was a vessel. It carried a mother's love, a daughter's grief, a stranger's compassion, and a second chance for them all. In the meticulous act of its restoration, a father reclaimed his purpose, a CEO reconnected with her heart, and a little girl learned that her dad was not just a fixer of walls, but a keeper of stories. This is the alchemy of hidden skill. It's not about secret talents waiting for a spotlight. It's about the humanity that fuels them, the patience, the empathy, the stubborn belief that nothing precious is ever truly beyond saving. These are the tools we all possess, often without knowing their strength. We are all restorers of something. We mend conversations, patch up trust, repair hope in small, daily ways. Leo's story is just a magnified reflection of that universal work. The world moves fast, celebrating the new, the shiny, the immediately useful. But history, memory, and meaning are carried in the old, the faded, the lovingly made. They are the anchors in our relentless current. To preserve them is not nostalgia. It is an act of defiance against time, against entropy, against the lie that only the new has value. It is a declaration that some connections are worth the painstaking, invisible work of repair. As for Leo, he still paints walls sometimes. He says it keeps him grounded. But most days, you'll find him in the Alina Merck studio at the museum, sunlight streaming through the window, teaching a new generation how to listen to the whispers of old canvas and fatting ink. Mia is a regular visitor, her own artistic spark now nurtured in a world where art is not just made, but cared for. And in Alina Vance's office, the portrait of her mother still watches over the deals and decisions, a permanent reminder that behind every empire of steel, there is a heart that remembers how to soften. We are, each of us, a collection of stories, some bright and new, some stained and torn. The most courageous thing we can do is to pick up the needle and thread, the brush and solvent, the kind word or the forgiving silence, and begin the work of making whole. Because you never know when the thing you save might just, in the end, save you right back. If you believe that the most extraordinary heroes are often the quietest ones, the the ones who fix what's broken not for glory, but because it's simply the right thing to do. Then subscribe. Your curiosity fuels our search for the next hidden story, the next secret competence waiting in the wings.